As the president prepares to head to Asia this week, the Biden administration is also making moves in this hemisphere. The White House announced plans Tuesday to ease some economic sanctions on Venezuela as a gesture meant to encourage ongoing talks between the government of Nicolas Maduro and opposition leaders. The changes will allow the Chevron Corporation to negotiate its license with the state-owned oil company, but won't allow them to drill or export any Venezuelan petroleum. And U.S. officials say this easing of sanctions can be reversed if the Maduro government takes steps to quash opposition parties. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is also revamping U.S. policy towards Cuba. Among other things, it will mean more commercial flights to the island, more visas for Cubans to leave the island, and no limit on the amount of money that people can send to relatives. All of it, according to the State Department, is an attempt to help boost freedom and opportunity in Cuba. But it is, of course, being met by criticism here in Washington from those opposed to closer relations with the Cuban or Venezuelan governments, and some who think the Biden administration took too long to go back to the way things were during the Obama years. Joining us now is Juan Gonzalez. He's a special assistant to the president and senior director for the Western Hemisphere on the National Security Council. Juan, thank you for joining us as you guys make these announcements this week. Summarize them for people who don't follow Latin American geopolitics this closely and explain why are these changes necessary in the view of the Biden administration, and why are they happening now?
Sure. So thanks, Ed, for the opportunity. First, let me start with Cuba. After the July 11th protests last year, where a large number of Cubans throughout the island were demanding more rights, access to food, as they were suffering from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the brutal crackdown against peaceful protesters was something that was seen around the world. And the president gave us two directions coming out of those protests. Number one is to increase the pressure on the regime and to defend human rights. And so we've had active pace of individual sanctions. We've had a messaging campaign pointing out individuals that have been engaged in the crackdown against protesters and just individuals that are demanding greater freedom, even musicians and artists. The second direction from the president was to find ways to engage directly with the Cuban people. So we sought to work with the private sector and humanitarian organizations to deliver aid. We offered vaccines, and we've even expanded support for censorship circumvention technology and other supports for the families of those who've been detained by the regime. This latest action are a set of practical steps that are designed at building bridges to the Cuban people. They're ones where the Cuban Family Reunification Program are things that Democrats and Republicans support, the Cuban American community wants. Making sure that our consular section is functioning and that we're processing visas out of Havana. That we are taking measures to allow people who are visiting family to be able to fly outside of Havana. As you mentioned, allowing commercial and charter flights to go to places outside of Havana. But also on remittances is we're not going to take any entity off the Cuba restricted list that was created by the previous administration, but we are lifting the caps on individual remittances and on donative remittances, and also really leaning into electronic payments as a tool to allow Cuban Americans and others to support their families on the island. At the same time, we're continuing to press the regime on matters of human rights. Now, there's overlap between that and Venezuela because we are consistently supporting dialogue. It's something that the president has been very clear on since day one, that a peaceful, negotiated resolution to the humanitarian and political crisis is something that is a matter of U.S. policy. And what is happening today is the regime and the unity platform, the Venezuelan opposition, have agreed to return to dialogue in Mexico. The opposition and the interim government of Juan Guaido have approached us to ask to take a number of measures, specifically on licenses for Chevron, just to talk to the regime, and a number of other measures that we'll announce after they actually release a statement that they're going to return to the talks. Very important here is that, number one, the regime or the opposition has asked for this. Number two, it is on the basis of negotiations. And number three, if there's an absence of progress or return to the negotiating table, we're gonna take away those moves.
So on Venezuela, for example, if the Maduro regime were to stop showing up for those meetings in Mexico City, you turn the sanctions back on?
That's exactly right. So the U.S. policy framework is we're going to alleviate sanctions pressure on the basis of ambitious, concrete, and irreversible outcomes at negotiations that lead toward free and fair elections. we will reimpose those sanctions if there are steps backward or regress in those talks.
In terms of Cuba, what you're trying to do here is restore policy to what it was essentially during the Obama years, at least in part. Now, this political situation didn't really change much on the island during those years that it was the way it was during the Obama years. The government's still holding protesters that took to the streets last July, for example. Why make a change, A, when those prisoners are still in prison? And why is this time going to be any different? And couldn't all this just get reversed again if Republicans were to win the White House in a few years?
Well, this is very different from what the Obama administration did. These are practical steps that are in our unilateral interest, intended to address the humanitarian situation in the country where people are having lack of access to food. People and it's driving outbound migration. They're ones that are in our interest to try to build bridges to Cubans. It's also about reuniting Cuban Americans with Cuba, be able to promote that dialogue. We are not, for example, putting in place the individual people-to-people category under a general license, which was done under the Obama administration, but we are establishing the group people-to-people category, making very clear that we're going to make sure that people abide with the law. But we want universities, we want think tanks, we want educational institutions to go down to Cuba and to talk to the people, because Americans are the best ambassadors for freedom as far as the President of the United States is concerned. Now, can those policies be reversed? Certainly. Hard to speak to that, but I will say that on electronic payments, when we've talked to companies that are in this space, they have the regulatory space to be able to work. They are concerned about the political risks. So we are talking to Democrats and Republicans about delivering a very clear message that there's bipartisan support for electronic payments so that we can circumvent the government altogether and allow people to send remittances directly to family members and to entrepreneurs on the island. That's another section.
You're talking about like Venmo or PayPal companies like that?
A number of different processors that have not stepped in because there is a policy uncertainty.
One of the most prominent critics of all this is Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio. He had something to say about this earlier today. I want to have everyone take a listen, and then we'll have you respond.
They have sympathizers within the administration, combined with the fact that the Cuban regime is threatening them with mass migration, as they seem to do with every Democratic administration. And so what you're seeing is the beginning of a move towards, less than a year after that regime brutally cracked down on protests, you're seeing the beginning of a movement back towards Obama-era policies towards Cuba that were a massive failure.
So he says there that there are sympathizers to the Cuban regime inside the Biden administration. Are you one of those sympathizers?
No, and I would say that if you actually look at the people that came out to protest, they don't want to leave. They want change. And so our policies are geared to building bridges with them directly, providing support, making very clear that we are also supporting their ability to communicate with each other and to circumvent censorship by the regime. We're going to continue to sanction individuals responsible for human rights. These are measures that are practical and they are in our unilateral interest to advance. But the president has been clear on human rights in Cuba.
He also says these actions are being taken in response to threats from the Cuban regime. What kind of threats would he be referring to?
Yeah, I think historically the Cuban regime has used migration as a weapon. We've seen it at Mariel and other places. But that's not why we're doing this. We are doing this, and it's something that I got to be very clear. The president met with Cuban American leaders. He sent Secretary Mayorkas down to Miami. I have talked to the community, engaged with Congress to try to better understand where there are areas of consensus here. And ultimately, the president made a decision that is focused on building bridges directly with the Cuban people, the humanitarian support, but then still very much continuing to have a very strong stance on matters of human rights.
Real quick, two things. First off, was there any consideration to domestic political reaction to this, especially in Florida, where, of course, changes to Cuba and Venezuela policy can really resonate and affect elections not only in that state, but for Congress, for governor?
Yeah, well, on the National Security Council, we do policy. So we were focused on the policies that we thought would help the Cuban people, advance the cause of human rights, and support dialogue in Venezuela. Because ultimately, if we see steps that take Venezuela closer to free and fair elections, they've had an impact.
And real quick, part of the concern here among fellow leaders in the hemisphere is that Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua won't be invited to the Summit of the Americas, which is scheduled for next month in Los Angeles. Have the invitation? Will they be invited? You keep saying, I know in recent days the invitations haven't gone out. When are they going out?
So the invitations have not gone out. I don't have anything to report. They will go soon. The summit is a number of weeks away. But we wanted to definitely roll out these policy moves and not really equate the participation in the Summit of the Americas with policies that we have been working on for over a year to prepare to roll out this week.
So we shouldn't see any connection between all this and the invite list that's coming soon?
Correct.
Okay. Juan Gonzalez, who is a special advisor to the President with the National Security Council, thank you so much.